It started like any other day for Major Tiana Brooks. She had just wrapped up a joint training operation at the federal base an hour outside the city and was driving home in her unmarked black SUV. Still in uniform, decorated with a dozen earned bars and a crisp set of gold insignia, Tiana looked like someone straight out of a military recruitment poster. The kind of figure you salute on sight. But not that afternoon. As she approached a quiet intersection near the outskirts of town, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A local patrol car. Then another. No siren, no reason. Just the lights. She pulled over calmly, rolled down her window, and waited. 2 officers approached. One tapped the glass with his flashlight and asked for her license and registration. The other hovered behind him, hand already resting on his holstered weapon. "Ma'am, this vehicle came back flagged. We're going to need you to step out." Tiana furrowed her brow. Flagged for what? No need for questions. Step out of the car. She complied without resistance. Years of service had taught her to de-escalate first. As she stood outside, one officer began patting her down roughly. The other opened her passenger door and began rifling through her bags. "You're interfering with a federal officer," she warned, her voice cool and measured. "You need to stop this now." But they didn't. In fact, they doubled down. One of them chuckled. "Ma'am, we don't care what uniform you put on. You're being detained." And just like that, they cuffed her. She didn't shout. She didn't protest. Instead, she calmly asked, "Can I make one phone call?" He rolled his eyes. "You'll get your call. But it won't help you." He was wrong. Back seat. Hands cuffed. Radio chatter echoing from the front. Tiana sat still, her military posture never faltering, even with her wrists locked tight behind her. One officer smirked at her through the rearview mirror. The other was thumbing through her military credentials, ignoring the badges, clearance tags, and a Department of Defense access card clipped to her duffel. "Impressive cosplay," he muttered, tossing it aside. Tiana gave him one look, sharp, steady, and silent. Once they arrived at the small-town precinct, she was processed like any civilian. Mugshot. Fingerprints. No questions. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the uniform she wore. Until they let her make her call. Tiana dialed a secured number from memory. "Colonel Vega's office," a woman answered. "This is Major Brooks. Immediate protocol escalation. I've been unlawfully detained. Badge ID 947 Alpha." There was a pause. Then, "Hold 1 second. Click." Less than 30 seconds later, the phone was yanked from her hand. The officer on duty stared at the screen like it had started hissing. He looked pale. Another officer burst in. "What the hell did you just do?" Tiana didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside the station, headlights flooded the lot, 3 black government vehicles. Men and women in sharp suits stepped out, badges already visible. Inside, the mood changed instantly. The officer who had arrested her started pacing. His partner stood frozen, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Tiana was uncuffed without a word. But it was far too late. The air in the precinct shifted like a storm rolling in, silent, suffocating, and sudden. The lead agent from the black vehicles stepped forward. "Major Brooks, are you injured?" "No," she said calmly, rubbing her wrists. "But they compromised a federal officer and obstructed classified transport." The agent nodded once, then turned sharply to the 2 arresting officers. "Names." Neither officer spoke. One stammered. The other looked down at his boots. "You tampered with a DoD asset. Unlawfully detained a high-clearance military officer. And you ignored her identification while in uniform." One of the suits pulled out a portable device, held it up, and scanned Tiana's discarded ID badge from the evidence bin. It lit up green. A second later, the device chirped. Confirmed. Tier 4 authorization. National Security Transport Class. The arresting officer's jaw slackened. "We thought it was fake, you thought wrong," the agent snapped. "You just triggered a level 2 internal security breach. Do you have any idea what that means?" The precinct captain emerged from his office, flustered. "Is there a problem here?" The agent didn't even look at him. "This entire station is now under federal review." The captain froze. "Wait, hold on, this is a misunderstanding. We didn't know who she was." "You didn't care who she was." Tiana stood up slowly and retrieved her bag herself. She looked at the officers, especially the one who called her uniform cosplay. "You didn't even check. And now, your careers are over." Silence. Outside, one of the agents began handing sealed packets to the officers on duty, official notices. The kind that came with immediate suspensions and pending termination. The precinct was in chaos. Phones started ringing. Internal Affairs was already alerted. The Department of Justice had been looped in. And the officers who arrested Major Tiana Brooks were now being escorted, without their badges, without their weapons, into a separate interview room. No one spoke to them. No one looked them in the eye. Their desks were cleared within the hour. Outside, media had started to gather. Someone must have tipped them off about the sudden federal presence. Cameras panned over the scene as sleek black vehicles pulled away, and a tall black woman in uniform stepped into the front passenger seat of the lead car, stone-faced and silent. Tiana didn't speak to reporters. She didn't need to. The headline would write itself by nightfall. Back at the federal facility, Tiana was met with a standing ovation. Her commanding officer, Colonel Vega, approached her with a somber nod. "You handled that with precision. Washington's already moving on it. They're not sweeping this under the rug." "Not about me," she said quietly. "It's about the next officer they pull over without a second thought." Vega nodded. "Still, your call ended 2 careers today." "Not because I had power," Tiana replied. "Because they abused theirs." Weeks later, the internal review was complete. The 2 officers were found guilty of misconduct, unlawful detainment of a federal officer, and failure to verify active credentials. Their certifications were permanently revoked. One attempted to appeal, only to be met with a sealed affidavit detailing classified violations. The appeal was dismissed without a hearing. The precinct captain quietly retired. But Tiana? She returned to her duties. No press conferences. No interviews. She didn't chase headlines, though they followed her for a while. Federal major wrongfully arrested by local officers, their careers ended with one call. That was the narrative the world saw. What they didn't see was the quiet shift across departments. New policies were rolled out nationwide: cross-verification for uniforms, ID protocol reforms, mandatory officer briefings on military recognition. Tiana's one phone call didn't just end 2 careers. It rewrote the playbook. And though she rarely spoke of the incident, one quote, captured by a bystander's phone as she stepped into the SUV that day, circulated long after the footage faded: "Next time, check the stripes before you reach for the cuffs." Though the official case was closed, the ripple effects were far from over. The town's mayor issued a public statement, vague and defensive, blaming miscommunication and procedural oversight. But local citizens weren't convinced. A petition launched within days, demanding more transparency, accountability, and better training across the force. It gained over 200,000 signatures in less than a week. Meanwhile, Tiana Brooks became a quiet symbol in military circles, not for what she said, but for how she handled what was done to her. She received a private commendation from the Pentagon. Not for retaliation, but for restraint. For discipline. For doing what others might not have survived with such composure. Behind closed doors, federal agencies began conducting cross-department seminars using her case as a scenario study. It became required material in some regions: how not to treat someone in uniform, regardless of gender, status, or background. One of the dismissed officers eventually spoke to the press, off the record. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be, he said. The scariest thing about that day wasn't the agents. It was realizing she had more control in cuffs than we did in uniform. Tiana never responded to the comment. She had already moved on, to a new assignment overseas, continuing her career with the same quiet excellence that had always defined her. But for anyone who was there that day in that precinct, one truth would never be forgotten: some people wear their authority on their chest. Others carry it in silence, and when they speak, the whole room listens. Months passed. The story faded from headlines, replaced by newer controversies and louder scandals. But inside federal circles and law enforcement academies, Major Tiana Brooks's case became something else entirely: a case study in consequence. Her arrest video, quietly released after a FOIA request, became mandatory viewing in several departments. Not for its drama. For its lesson. Respect the uniform. Not just when it's convenient. The phrase was now etched on a wall at Fort Birchfield, just below a framed still of Tiana's Department of Defense ID. Back in her hometown, a scholarship was created in her name for young women entering military service. It was funded, anonymously, by a retired general who had served with her early in her career. It read, "For those who walk the line with discipline, dignity, and strength." And the precinct where it all happened? It received federal oversight. A new chief. A new set of rules. And a visible shift in culture. But Major Brooks never looked back. When asked in a rare closed-door briefing if she felt vindicated, she responded simply, "I didn't need revenge. I needed correction." Then she stood, saluted the room, and left. Because for Tiana, justice had never been about punishment. It had always been about accountability. Years later, a young cadet raised his hand during a training seminar. The topic was interagency respect and protocol. He asked, "Is it true? The story about the officer who made one call and changed everything?" The instructor, a decorated commander with silver in his beard, smiled faintly and nodded. "It's true," he said. "She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She gave them every chance to do the right thing." He paused, then added, "And when they didn't, she reminded them who they were dealing with." That cadet, like many others, would go on to carry that lesson into every stop, every encounter, every moment wearing a badge. Because they didn't just remember her name, they remembered the silence she carried like a shield, and the storm that followed when it was broken. Tiana Brooks never sought attention. She never wrote a book. Never gave a televised interview. But in precincts, military bases, and classrooms across the country, her story was still being told. Not for drama. For discipline. And every now and then, when a young officer hesitated, unsure of how to treat the quiet woman in uniform in front of him, he remembered. Some calls are louder than sirens. And some uniforms command more than respect, they change everything. 1 year later, in a small, closed-door accountability hearing, the two former officers sat across from a federal review board, not for reinstatement, but for mandatory reflection as part of a department reform case study. They weren't handcuffed. But they looked smaller than they once did in uniform. One of them, Officer Graham, spoke quietly. "I've arrested people before. I thought I was in control. But that day, she never raised her voice. Never tried to make us feel small. And still, I felt like I was 3 inches tall the moment I realized who she really was." The room remained still. He continued, "It wasn't about rank. It was about how sure she was. She knew who she was. We didn't even bother to ask." The other, Officer Mills, nodded slowly. We didn't just fail her. We failed the badge. Neither man was seeking forgiveness. And none was offered. But their statements were recorded, archived, and later used as part of a national training curriculum titled, Authority Misused, The Cost of Assumption. When the footage reached military ethics panels, it was accompanied by a single quote Major Tiana Brooks once gave in confidence, never meant for publication, but eventually shared with her permission: "You don't earn respect by demanding it. You earn it by remembering who you serve, especially when it's not convenient." And just like that, her story, quiet, powerful, and real, became a standard. A warning. And a guide. On a crisp morning 2 years after the incident, Major Tiana Brooks stood at a podium inside the National Law Enforcement Training Center. She wore no ribbons. No stars. Just a plain suit and calm presence. She wasn't there as a military officer today. She was the keynote speaker for a graduating class of future police leaders. The audience didn't know what to expect. Some had heard of her. A few had studied her case. Most knew the legend, not the woman. She began with no slides. No prepared speech. Just a pause, and then her voice. "The first time I was cuffed. I was wearing the same uniform I swore to defend. The ones who arrested me didn't ask who I was. They decided. Assumed. Acted. She let it sit. They weren't bad men. They were careless men. And that's what makes this complicated. Because most damage isn't done by villains, it's done by people too sure they're right to stop and listen." A hush fell over the room. No one shifted in their chairs. Some of you will wear badges. Others will command troops. You'll be trusted with power. But power isn't the right to act. It's the responsibility to know when not to. She stepped back from the podium. The room stood as one. Not out of habit, but because something in them had changed. As she left the building, a young recruit ran after her. "Ma'am," he said, breathless, "I just want to say, thank you. You made me want to be better before I even put this badge on." Tiana gave a soft smile, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you're already ahead of where they were." She turned and walked away. No cameras. No medals. Just the quiet gravity of someone who had lived the story others only read about. And long after she was gone, one phrase from that day stayed engraved above the academy doors: "Assumption ends where accountability begins." What began as a quiet incident in a backroad precinct had now reshaped conversations across the nation. Congress quietly pushed forward a bipartisan initiative called the Brooks Protocol, a set of standards requiring immediate ID verification procedures for uniformed personnel during civilian police interactions. It passed with near-unanimous support, bundled inside a larger law enforcement training reform bill. No one argued publicly against it. Tiana never gave a press conference about it, but her name was embedded in the footnotes of every draft. Across military bases, she became known not for her rank, but for her restraint. The quiet calm that de-escalated more effectively than any shout ever could. Law schools began citing the incident during ethics modules. News anchors mentioned it during discussions on professionalism and unconscious bias, without ever making it political. It had risen above that. Because what happened to her wasn't just about misjudgment. It was about what happens when systems forget to listen, and the people they underestimate know exactly what they're doing. Years later, a documentary crew asked her to participate in a series on authority and identity. She declined, but sent a single quote they could use. "I didn't want headlines. I wanted change. And sometimes, that starts with silence, and ends with a reckoning." It was the final line of the documentary. And it said everything. 5 years to the day after the incident, a plaque was mounted quietly in the lobby of the U.S. Department of Justice Training Division. It bore no gold leaf, no fanfare. Just engraved steel, Major Tiana Brooks for reminding the system what service looks like, under pressure, under judgment, and under cuffs. Tiana wasn't there for the ceremony. She had respectfully declined. She was stationed abroad, advising on international military-civilian relations. Still serving. Still silent. Still leading from the shadows. But her influence remained rooted back home. Police departments in all 50 states had updated their uniformed personnel protocol. Civilian complaint systems were revised with expedited federal review triggers. And a new phrase had quietly entered training manuals, coined by instructors and repeated in briefing rooms: "Don't let a Brooks moment define your career." For the officers who once mocked a uniform they didn't understand, that phrase cut deeper than any punishment. And for a generation of new recruits, it became a warning, and a guidepost. Major Brooks never returned to speak about the day. But those who learned from her didn't need her to. Her silence, her posture, and that one call, had already spoken louder than 1,000 voices ever could.